Okay, let's dive in. We've covered everything from quantum physics to global economics, but today we are jumping into something that feels, well, deeply human and foundational. We're doing a radical re-examination of the role of the witch doctor. And we're not looking at this figure as some kind of historical footnote or a relic. We're going to look at it through the lens of epistemology. So
Yeah,
how we know what we know, and just basic universal human psychology.
that's exactly right. And for you, the listener, the source material we're working from today, it really challenges one of our most ingrained assumptions. This idea that human thriving is always, always dependent on the pursuit of objective truth.
Right.
So our mission today is to extract a core insight from all this field work, and it's this. There is a vast, thriving market out there that is dedicated entirely to exploiting the suffering and failure of others. And we have to confront this really uncomfortable finding that deception, not truth, can sometimes be deliberately engineered to provide profound personal contentment. It can even be foundational to what some communities would define as peaceful human coexistence.
That's a profound inversion of how we typically think about progress. And what makes these sources so compelling is that they deliberately skip a lot of the academic formality that can, distort these issues. We're working directly from research rooted in over 37 years of immersive field experience in sub-Saharan Africa. The authors are explicit, they're drawing from indigenous people, from their languages, and intentionally setting aside formal, scholarly work that, well, in their view, just doesn't align with local realities.
Because that scholarship is often tainted by external bias.
Exactly.
And that brings us right to the first major hurdle we have to clear. It's this trap of epistemology. Specifically, the difference between what's called eidic and emic knowledge.
Etic versus emic. Okay, so that's the outsider's scientific view versus the insider's own lived experience. And the first place this clash creates confusion is in the language itself. The English term witchcraft is a huge problem, as the source points out.
It's a massive problem.
It's a term that refers to all these diverse, complex African concepts, and at the same time, it's referring to these outdated historical practices from Europe that are now globally just seen as primitive.
Yes, the word is just so dualistic. It carries all this historical baggage that shapes your perception from the moment you even use it. And what the sources detail is how this created a real crisis in formal African scholarship. You see, the early accounts, the foundational texts, they were all written by Western explorers, missionaries, anthropologists. This etic, or outsider, perspective became the authoritative foundation for everything that was known about the topic.
It became the default setting for all the research that came after.
Precisely, and the problem really comes up when African scholars, the emic, the insider perspective, when they enter the formal field, to get recognition, to get published, they were often required to use Western languages like English or French, and they had to conform their work to these existing etic accounts.
So they had to fit their reality into an outsider's box.
Yes. And the source describes this compliance as resulting in the introduction of implicit lies and distortions into formal accepted scholarship. It's a distortion rooted in a structural requirement.
And there's a simple analogy the source uses to illustrate this distortion, and it's incredibly helpful. The question is Africa hot or normal?
It's the perfect teaching tool. I mean, to a European visitor, Africa is obviously hot. But to someone who's lived there their whole life, it's just normal.
Sure.
But because globalized, Western-led education demands this comparative analysis, the African insider is often forced to adopt the outsider's viewpoint, to label their own home as hot.
And in doing that, they implicitly agree that their home is abnormal.
Yes, abnormal compared to this unspoken global standard, which is usually derived from, temperate zones.
And if you apply that same psychological pressure, that need to avoid being labeled abnormal or primitive to the concept of witchcraft, the consequences for accurate scholarship are just devastating.
They're profound. An emic, an insider view sees things like envy, jealousy, the need to counteract those forces. It's just a matter of fact. It's a basic, unavoidable part of intensive human engagement. But because the English term witchcraft is so associated with the primitive or the shameful, emic writers might consciously conceal or just downplay its actual prevalence in their communities to avoid that stigma. And the sources state this results in this widespread and key social phenomenon, essentially disappearing from view in all the formal academic accounts.
That's a powerful idea, that formal knowledge systems can literally force insiders to lie about their own lived reality. So if the scholarship is systematically distorting the reality, we need to focus on what the on-the-ground reality actually reveals about human behavior. And this brings us to the crucial psychological insight that, according to these sources, forms the entire basis of the witch doctor's market.
This is the truly universal observation at the heart of all this research. It's what they call the relativizing feature of human behavior. People rarely assess their well-being in, absolute static terms. We are competitive creatures. We assess our contentment, our success, our satisfaction relative to those around us.
This tendency to benchmark our own lives against others seems like a universal psychological truth no matter where you live.
Exactly. And the examples in the source material are perfect. Think about how we evaluate things. We don't just decide a car is big, we see it as bigger or smaller than others' cars. Or with family, parents often care so deeply about their child's class position, their rank in school, sometimes more than their actual exam percentage. That ranking is inherently comparative.
We are just hardwired to notice the gaps between ourselves and other people.
And this is where the dark utility comes from. Because of this relativizing feature, the shortfalls, the suffering, or the failure of others can lead directly to one's own personal satisfaction, to contentment, or, as the source explicitly calls it, utility.
That is a fascinating term for this kind of satisfaction utility. It sort of elevates Schadenfreude to an economic driver.
It absolutely does. And the sources give such impactful, relatable examples. Imagine the invigorating rush of glee one might feel discovering a jealous rival at work is mortally ill, or the satisfaction you'd get from seeing a business competitor fired for stealing. In that moment, the suffering of the other person gives the observer a measurable boost in their own emotional well-being. It makes their own life feel, for a moment, more bearable or even enjoyable.
And that boost, that rush of glee, that utility, if it's something you can get again and again, that is the economic consequence. That's the moment a market is born.
Absolutely. The existence of this reliable utility from others' suffering creates the possibility of a stable market. If people are willing to pay for that emotional uplift, someone will step forward to sell it. The sources are blunt here. People are ready to purchase the suffering and loss of others, or at least the convincing perception of that loss. Bad news sells. This creates a market for damage done to an enemy, whether that damage is real or just perceived.
Okay, so if that psychological utility creates the demand, we can now look at who steps in as the supplier in this market. And this brings us to the witchdoctor as the professional operative. Their service is to arrange for the suffering, failure, or demise of others, all to make the client feel good, giving them that precious utility they crave.
And what's truly fascinating and absolutely critical to understanding this system is that the utility you get from bad news is not contingent on the news being true. Deception is a perfectly saleable product. The client doesn't need proof of their enemy's failure, they just need conviction. The most important thing is convincing the client that their enemy is failing or suffering, whether it's actually happening or not. As long as the deception is believed, the client thrives on that bad news and is happy to pay for it.
It's hard to wrap my head around that. Are we saying deception is actually preferred over truth if it keeps things stable? Is the community conscious of this deception?
The sources suggest that in these contexts, deception is sometimes functional. It's preferable for maintaining social order. And this leads to a really shocking social paradox described in the research, which is that the belief in witchcraft, often fueled by this kind of deception, can actually reduce physical violence.
How is that possible? We associate these beliefs with fear and suspicion, not with peace.
Well, take the scenario they described. A woman is so enraged with her neighbor that she is actively planning to physically beat her to death with a club or a stone. If she genuinely believes that a witch doctor will use supernatural means to kill that neighbor instead, she's deterred from doing the physical violence herself. The deception provides the utility she wants, the enemy's demise, without all the negative repercussions of, murder or assault.
That is a striking departure from conventional wisdom, as presented by the source. It suggests that for some societies, these beliefs act as this strange, non-physical check on aggression.
It does, and you have to sit with that idea for a moment. A belief system often dismissed as just superstition is, according to this research, actively saving lives. It provides an alternative, non-physical outlet for murderous rage. The core fear driving all this is that someone's ill will, their envy, can itself cause you misfortune, even without a clear physical mechanism. And the witch doctor offers protection and relief from this fear by providing that required utility, all through orchestrated, believable deception.
Let's connect this craft directly to the massive concept of sacrifice, because the source material explicitly links the two practices. It says they're fundamentally the same system.
They share the same psychological DNA. Sacrifice, whether it's historical animal sacrifice or human sacrifice, it's also a mechanism for acquiring utility, For ensuring the community thrives from the suffering or death, real or perceived, of another, the individual or community that stays alive gains utility from the one that's sacrificed. And this act, often through bloodshed, acts as a form of cleansing. It reduces deep-seated social tensions and brings, as the source puts it, good mental health.
And the research frames this as a historical necessity, and it defines peace in a very particular way.
Exactly. The source argues that until a radical alternative was introduced, the practice of animal or human sacrifice was frequently not optional. In this context, it was, in the source's view, required to ensure the thriving of human communities. Peace was simply the state that followed the defeat or subjugation of your enemy. It was a zero-sum game, rooted entirely in the necessary suffering of someone else.
But then the source introduces an alternative that challenges this entire psychological and economic system.
Yes. The introduction of Jesus' self-sacrifice is presented as the singular alternative sacrifice. For believers, this one act can render the witch doctor services and the need for ritual slaughter nullified or superfluous. It provides a new foundation for contentment that doesn't require anyone else's failure or suffering.
This shift is central to the whole argument that researchers are making, and it's a massive claim. The peace from this alternative is described using that famous line from John 14:27. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth.
That phrase is crucial. It defines the revolutionary nature of the peace being offered. It does not arise from someone else's failure or loss or suffering. And here is where we get to that immense claim you mentioned. The sources argue that Jesus' act was singularly the truth, a revolutionary orientation intended to penetrate societies that were previously guided by necessary deception just for their own survival.
How does the source elaborate on that connection? What specific shift in perception does abandoning deception enable, according to the research?
It enables the perception of the real. When the need for utility through the deception and suffering of others is removed, the mind is no longer reliant on a fabricated reality for its contentment. The sources argue that this new orientation toward a singular truth, away from the social necessity of deception, enabled the fundamental perception of the world, the real world, that eventually led to the discoveries of modern science. The scientific method demands a rigorous reality check, a pursuit of truth regardless of whether that truth provides you with immediate comparative utility.
That is a staggering conclusion. That the historical necessity of deception as a social glue had to be psychologically severed before scientific inquiry could truly flourish. It links epistemology and psychology directly to the physical world. Okay, let's bring this profound framework back to the listener and connect it to contemporary issues. The source argues this opposition between a system requiring the suffering of others and one that doesn't, it still exists today.
It does. The research is very clear about the negative ramifications of the witch doctor's way of life. A life defined by relying on deception and needing others to suffer for your own benefit. It leads to a crippling mutual suspicion, to poverty, endemic disease, pervasive fear, and a truncated life expectancy. Conversely, the sources argue that faith in Christ's self-sacrifice removes that fundamental psychological requirement for others to suffer, and this then allows Christians, as the source mentions, to love their enemies and genuinely rejoice in their enemies thriving.
So where do we see the witch doctor's craft operating today, in a technologically advanced 21st century setting? What's the modern parallel for this market of utility from fabricated suffering?
The source draws a very strong, very specific link between the witch doctor's craft and contemporary concerns about fake news. It's an identical structure.
Let's break that down. How does modern media consumption mirror paying a witch doctor for utility?
The mechanism is functionally the same. The witch doctor is paid for fabricated bad news about a client's specific enemy, which grants the client emotional utility. In the modern context, faked news is saleable because it brings utility to some at the cost of truth. We pay, not always with cash, but with our attention, our clicks, our engagement. This attention is the currency we use to purchase the utility of seeing a political enemy or a social rival or an opposing group fail, suffer, or be humiliated, even if the news is completely fabricated or distorted.
So the media feeds that deep-seated psychological desire for others' failure to boost one's own sense of well-being or the well-being of your chosen group.
Exactly. It is, in effect, a technologically mediated payment to a digital witch doctor for a utility-generating deception. And this system thrives on the same fundamental human psychology of comparative success. It's why we have to understand the mechanics of the traditional witch doctor's craft to really see the roots of our modern information systems.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into psychology and epistemology.
The core revelation for you, the listener, is this. The witch doctor's craft is not some fringe magical system. It's a pragmatic business model built on the universal human tendency to derive satisfaction from comparative success. It monetizes the failure of others, whether that failure is real or strategically fabricated.
And that knowledge forces us to consider that human communities may, at times, rely on orchestrated deception for their contentment, or even for their perceived social stability.
Indeed. It suggests that the pursuit of pure, unvarnished truth might sometimes be a profoundly disruptive force to our psychological contentment. But here's the final provocative thought to leave you with, drawing on the source's idea that Christ's self-sacrifice is psychological, a continual orientation of the mind away from the need for others to suffer. How much of our modern daily consumption of digital media, which feeds us with many forms of sacrifice like war, political failure, suffering, and scandal, is simply a disguised modern form of paying a witch doctor for utility? And if we genuinely stopped paying for that bad news, how would we truly define our own well-being then?